My name is Allison Felis, and this is I'll Follow You, a podcast featuring light and lively conversations about film, music, and creative culture, coming to you from the People's Republic of Rogers Park on the far northeast side of Chicago. Episode number 10. Well, how about that? Big thanks to everyone for sticking around and helping me get this here podcast up into double digits. Today on the show, I'm incredibly pleased to be in conversation with Angie Yingst. Angie is a published writer, a sacred artist, a Usui Reiki Master Teacher, and an Earth Medicine Practitioner specializing in shamanic and crystal healing techniques. Angie has been reading tarot for 30 years and is a member of the American Tarot Association. She has also trained through Hibiscus Moon Crystal Academy as a certified crystal healer and an advanced crystal master, and she now serves the school and its community as curriculum specialist and crystal coach. Angie has also been studying since 2012 with Pixie Lighthorse and has completed all 4 levels of her training through SouLodge Earth Medicine School. Angie offers both in-person and distance one-on-one healing sessions that combine crystal healing, shamanic healing, Reiki, drum and rattle, breathwork, and plant medicine to facilitate healing in her clients, balancing her work with the moon cycles and seasonal energies to maximize healing potential. Angie teaches tarot, crystals and crystal healing, shamanic work, psychic development and intuitive work, creative and art workshops, and offers group healing sessions through the Alta View Wellness Center in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Today, we dig deep to talk about grief, addiction, perfectionism, and the dangers of spiritual bypassing, as well as the difference between being a guru and an effective space holder. Let's dive in. Hi, Angie. Well, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Well, and I'm really excited too, because we were sort of saying as we were corresponding about this, or I don't know if I was even saying it explicitly, but I was thinking that my spirituality and sort of my energy practices and stuff are such a big part of my life and what I sort of read and consume and think about and how I sort of organize the way that I live. And that's something that I haven't touched on a ton in the podcast. And so I was like, oh, what better person to have in conversation about this? Because you're sort of similarly you do everything like crystals and Reiki and tarot. And so I'm just super excited to do a deep dive here with you today.
Oh, thanks. I'm so excited to share it. I think part of what you're talking about is we do so many things. And so it's easy to be a holy man on the mountain, but actually doing it in real life is a whole other thing,
And which is what I've always, I'll before I shut up and let you talk about yourself, that's so much of what I've always responded to in the way that you work is your grounding. You have this great breadth of knowledge, but I feel like you always have this really, really amazing way of bringing it back down to the practical, and both in terms of the way that you coach the people that you work with, and then just in the way that I observe you sort of living your life. There's always this through line of how does it show up for you in the physical, which I think is really remarkable, because it's easy to get seduced and attracted by yes, let's go up on the Misty Mountains, and there's a time and a place for that, but like you said, having the practical grounded aspects to it I think is so important, and such a thing that you're very uniquely good at.
Thank you so much. That's my goal when in my work, is to make this not so esoteric and mystical. It's about sometimes little changes in big ways, and incorporating spirituality and ways that help with holistic health in small ways, to make huge changes in your life. So
So would you love to or I would just love for you to talk through sort of a little bit, what it is that you do and how you sort of define where you are on your journey as a practitioner right now.
It's been a really interesting journey because I kind of grew up, my parents are baby boomers and they were 18 in 1968. So they were kind of like in that hippie-ish life is everything's changing time, but they weren't exactly hippies, you know. Um, I'm sure, you know, they kind of incorporated, there was a lot of spirituality and changing their idea of spirituality, but they were both very Catholic. So I had this interesting upbringing where I was raised Catholic. I had very strong kind of like going to church, going to, you know, CCD kind of idea. And then my mom would take us to rock shops to pick crystals if we were distraught, and she would have like a glass of water on an altar for her ancestors, and because my mother's from Central America, so I kind of grew up like with rocks and with this kind of spirituality. And when I became a teenager, just really found, my sister and I found a tarot. I have an identical twin sister, and we found a tarot deck. So I think it was, we were like 15 and we got a book and a tarot deck and we shared it. So I started reading tarot at a very young age and kind of being like a goth punk rock kind of kid and kind of falling like into that realm, and then going to college and finding Buddhism. And maybe 2 years into college, I dropped out and moved west, and I married, my first husband is Native American. And so his spirituality was kind of woven into Catholicism as well. And then we met witches and we started hanging out with like covens, you know, but we weren't quite involved. A lot of it was like from the outside looking in. And then we would take some practices and weave them into our lives. And then, you know, so it's like been this journey that started when I was very young. And what really happened to me was I lost a child and had a lot of grief, and then got sober in grief, and suddenly was like, had every feeling that I had as a child of being a misfit and not fitting in and being really sensitive to my surroundings, sensitive to energy. All that started being really, really loud. And I did not know what to do with it. And I realized like I drank and partied and explored and moved around because I was kind of uncomfortable sitting still in who I was. Even though I had been practicing meditation since I was 16, I still really struggled being sober and being in myself. And I also realized I was like a raw nerve. So all of the work I do now is from that part of my journey of being really uncomfortable in my skin and trying to figure out how am I going to get comfortable. And when I started seeking out people who could guide me, it kind of went into this realm of healing and incorporating things I had done. It was very validating. It was things I had already done for years, but really kind of exploring. First, I did Reiki, which is the gateway to other kinds of healing, I think. I started doing Reiki, and then I did crystal healing. I started training as a shamanic healer, and I was still doing my tarot the entire time, all those 30 years of tarot, and just kind of weaving all of that together. And now my practice is very, you know, I see people in one-on-one sessions, and then I teach classes. I hold circles for women and for men. And I teach online. I work at Hibiscus Moon Crystal Academy, which is an academy that teaches crystal healing and hands-on healing. So, yeah, I had been doing tarot my entire adult life. I would sometimes, you know, like give my deck away, or I used to be kind of embarrassed about the tarot, and then I would kind of hide it because I thought it was silly and like a goth teenager thing to do, because I was a goth teenager when I picked it up. So, but you know, kind of coming back to it. And what happened was people started asking me if I would do readings for them, and they, you know, offered to pay me for it. Because I was saying, nah, I don't feel like it today. And they're like, no, can I pay you? Would you feel like it if I paid you? And I realized that was a really important boundary for me, in terms of energy exchanging, you know, just being able to say, yeah, an hour of my time is worth this much money, and starting to figure out like, okay, I can't just keep giving and giving and giving as a healer. I need to charge for it a little bit. But yeah, so I started, I was already doing tarot for people for money, and then, kind of wove in the other things. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I love that was like a boundary you discovered, because I think that, I mean, I still get that, like, as a person who is sort of perceived as quote unquote spiritual, where people come to me for advice and whatever. And it often, since I don't read tarot, like I love tarot as like this like shorthand for like people understand what that is, like, from an energy healing perspective. It's like a lot of times I have to sort of like, if I'm talking to people who sort of aren't in that like world or aren't like sort of interested in different disciplines, it's like those are the two things that people understand is Reiki and tarot, as like, and then I'll say, well, I was like, well, kind of what I do is kind of like tarot reading, but like I don't actually use the cards, but anyway, just wrapping that back around. But like, yeah, having that sense of yourself as a person that people come to, I mean, was that like starting to happen more and more, where people sort of knew you as like, oh yeah, Angie can give me advice on how to live my life, or Angie can give me advice on like, what kind of spiritual path, I should be, paying attention to? Was that like a hallmark of the way that you were interacting with relationships with people?
Yeah. I mean, from the time I was like born, I kind of was like one of those people that everyone called, for like, oh, what should I be doing? And because I was so interested in spirituality, I was always kind of seeking. So I was, if there was a Hare Krishna meeting, I would go to it just to like dance and sing. And then, if somebody invited me to a synagogue, I would go there. I would always say yes to a spiritual experience. And so I kind of had a lot of knowledge. And then when I ended up getting my degree, I became a religion major. So I mean, my studies were to go and pray with other people, but I couldn't quite make the leap between observing and participating. Like I was not really great at participating. And I realized it's because I kept like opting out, like, I mean, well, how they treat women is not okay with me. And so I can't really pray here. Instead of just taking what I needed and leaving the rest. So really, I hate to say this, but when I admitted I was an alcoholic and got into recovery, my whole life in relationship with spirituality changed. And I stopped trying to define what I was and just had an experiential relationship with the divine or spirit. I mean, I don't even call it God. It's just spirit, I just, something that's greater than me, or, that mysterious thread that runs through all things that connects us all kind of made sense to me, because I was relying on myself and I was failing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, recovery is it's a very spiritual process, because you get on your knees, you have to basically, you hit a bottom, and my bottom does not look like other people's bottom. Nobody really accused me of being an alcoholic. I wasn't in that place where everybody could see my desperation, but I felt like I was drowning all the time, and I had a lot of anxiety. And so when I finally said, well, maybe I'll just try quitting drinking and see what happens, it was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've interwoven my life around this experience. Because, I had an idea of what an artist was and what a writer was, and it always involved alcohol. That was kind of, everybody I loved was a heroin addict in music, and everybody I liked that were artists were alcoholics. And I just didn't really think I could create art or do, anything I really wanted to do without alcohol. So once I took that away, I had an identity crisis, and I had, also a walk of humility that I had to kind of incorporate into my being and figure out, what does this mean now? Who am I now? And that's really that spiritual quest that we all go on at some point, but it was
well, and I think that's interesting too, that, I mean, because one of the things that I I admire about the way that you sort of present in the world is all these overlapping personalities and all these overlapping, I shouldn't say personalities, but like aspects of who you are, you know, where you're the mother, you're the healer, you're the writer, you're the artist, you know, and I think I find that interesting that you say that like you felt like you didn't present as an alcoholic, you know, when you were hitting the point where you had to sort of like change your relationship with drinking. Cause I think that is sort of a weird aspect of sort of being a woman sometimes, where it is easier to compartmentalize your suffering, you know, and not have that be on other people. Whereas I think that, you know, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these sort of like heroin, you know, addict artists and stuff, I think who are really seductive are these manly figures. Yes. Who it's all splayed out for the world to see. So like, that's interesting coming from this sort of opposite perspective where you felt like it was really hidden.
Oh yeah. And I think, you know, it's a really interesting part that you bring up because, you know, as a woman, I have a lot of kind of masculine ways of being in the world, you know, like I'm opinionated and, you know, I could be competitive and, you know, I was kind of organized. And so I had this idea of what an alcoholic looked like, which was, you know, drinking out of a bag, sitting on the side of the street, or the way I saw men show up as alcoholics, because that's really what we would see in the movies. You wouldn't necessarily see a ton of women as alcoholics. So what does it look like for a woman? Well, it looked like perfectionism for me. You know, what it looked like was me trying really hard for everyone to think I was a super good mom. So, you know, my house was super organized and I did all the dishes. So I had all these rules for my drinking. I wouldn't drink until my kids were in bed and everything was organized and set up in this certain way so that no one could point the finger and say, you're a bad mom. Because I knew what an alcoholic mom looked like. Now, I don't have an alcoholic mom, but you know, I just assumed she was passed out drunk on the couch. So I wasn't doing that. So I don't think I presented that way. But what I would do is put everybody to sleep and then sit up with a bottle and write all night, you know, and then wake up hungover. And it wasn't blacking out or passing out. I was just drinking more than I was comfortable with, you know. So I had to adjust my idea of what's a bottom for me. And you know, really come to terms with the fact that this isn't working for me. You know, what does Jung say? You can have the spirits or you can have spirit.
Right.
You know, they're occupying the same space. So, you know, he often says that he had a lot of letters with Bill W. talking about this, you know, the man who founded AA, talking about how do you get sober or how do you drink and have God? Well, you can't do both, in his opinion. First of all, you know, being a bereaved mom and losing a child, I had a stillbirth at 38 weeks. And that obviously brought me to my knees. But, you know, I was in a very spiritual place before my daughter died. And I had this moment after my daughter died where I was in the hospital and I'm sitting there, you know, they tell you, hey, we can't find a heartbeat. And then you're going to have to give birth to this baby now. And I was like, what? Like, it's just, you know, it was shocking. I didn't even know this still happened, stillbirth. And I was like, you know, I can't do that. And they're like, well, you're going to have to. If you ever want to have another child, you know, you're just going to have to do this. We can't just, because I was like, just cut the baby out. I don't want to see anything. You know, I was really adamant. They're like, you're going to have to do this. So they start inducing you and you sit there for 24 hours knowing that you're going to give birth to a baby who has died. And they ask you to make funeral arrangements and do all of this stuff while you're in labor doing that.
Jesus.
It was shocking. You know, this kind of suffering wasn't really on my radar. And so I'm sitting there and they give you a grief packet because it happens to like 1 in 125 women. So it's not as rare as it sounds like it's going to be. So I get this packet and it's like a newsletter for a grief support. And the first thing on there was this letter. And I start reading it and it's like a letter to a baby. And I'm reading it and I was like, I have read this before. And it was weird because I didn't think I knew anybody who had gone through what I was going through. And I got to the bottom and it was my coworker. I worked at a corporation. I was a marketing coordinator for an engineering firm. And it was one of the graphic artists. And I'd remembered that she had a preterm baby who died, but I didn't ever ask her about grief. I never asked her how she was doing after the first week after she came back. It went out of my radar because it wasn't my experience, right? Which is, kind of how we all are. But I had this sort of moment of like, oh my gosh, this happens to people all the time. And I've been so oblivious to suffering. And the nurse who was helping me was a Unitarian minister. And she would just come in for, 20, 30 minutes at a time and talk to me about my spiritual condition in that moment. And I felt, I hate to say this sounds terrible, but I felt kind of enlightened, like, oh my gosh, we all have this thread of suffering through us, and that's grief and loss. And whether you lost a job or a child, or it's all the same grief. Like, it was so obvious and apparent to me. And I had this like weird feeling of peace, even though I was in the most horrible time of my life. And, intermixed with that, obviously, like great sadness, and I was crying, but I had a sense of feeling connected to all living beings through suffering. And I never really understood that part of like Buddhism, where they say all life is suffering. And I felt it in that moment. And I had that kind of cloud for like a week or two. And then the real life started settling in, and all that anger and resentment at having lost my child started settling in. And I had this therapist who was a Buddhist. And I said to him, I told him this, and he said, so you lost your child and you lost your enlightenment. And I was like, oh my God, is that what happened to me? Like, it was like that profound drop where it's like, wow, I had a taste of what it's like to be connected. And that's when my drinking took off, like the darker drinking, where there's no illusion of fun. And so I had these experiences, and the moments I would find peace were in moments of connection with other people and meditation. And I was doing meditation through painting, and I would do these paintings of bodhisattvas, which are like little Buddhas that were specifically for grieving women. And then I would mail them around the world to women who were grieving. Cause you can't, I was not really in wanting 50 paintings of the same thing in my house. So I would just mail them off. And someone later told me, oh, you're channeling those paintings. And I was like, what does that mean? And so it kind of, all this stuff ended up interweaving, but for me, that point of suffering, that point of hitting bottom, how we walk one path and, something changes and diverts our path. And then we make meaning out of it. I don't think everything happens for a reason, but we have to make meaning out of what's happening to us. And for me, it was, hey, I had this touch of like, we all are connected. And then I lost that again. And when I lost that again, I was so angry. And I was so angry at normal people for having normal things, for not suffering, or not what I could see their suffering was. So part of how I show up on this path is just to say, like, listen, this is what my life is. Like, I made meaning out of it. I still have angry thoughts, and I have to learn how to deal with them. I still, am an alcoholic. I still have to go to a church basement and go to a meeting and connect with people. It doesn't just go away because I've been suddenly enlightened. You can lose that at any moment. So that's part of what I bring in as a healer, and what I want to teach and allow, like give permission to people to suffer and then make meaning out of it, to have bad feelings and not have the shame associated with them. Does that make sense? Because the shame is the part that kills us. That's the part that is like the self-destruct button on health and wellness, is shame. So I think I got
Absolutely.
off topic. Sorry.
No, that's amazing. No, and I was so interested to hear you speak on this because, as I've said to you before, I mean, there was a while there in sort of like the early 2010s where it was like everything, like especially online. I mean, you know, there were people doing this like in reality that weren't like as you know, as visible, I know, but online, it just felt like the online spirituality was so just like love and light and like, how can you manifest your best life and manifest your dreams? And that's all cool. I mean, that's all good and helpful and stuff. But like what immediately drew me to your work, like when we connected online was your sort of openness about talking about darkness and trauma. Cause I feel like there's much more acceptance of sort of like, you know, embracing your dark side and, you know, looking at the things that have wounded you and, you know, what are your trauma bonds and all that stuff. But it's so yeah, I mean, just because it's a little bit more common to hear talked about, I still think it's rare to the way that you combine in your work the acknowledgement of that darkness without then getting stuck in it and defining yourself by that darkness. It's like you have this very, very sensitive touch around being able to say like, yeah, like things suck. And, you know, there have been, you know, enormous hurdles and challenges, but then you also have this lightness to you where you're always sort of moving through that, like not in a way of minimizing it, but in a way of sort of like getting the fuller picture. So I admire so much the way that you're able to convey both sort of, you know, and obviously it's not either or, but just sort of this wider spectrum of the human experience where it is love and light and beautiful manifestations, but it's also, yeah, these dark nights of the soul.
Right. I mean, the love and light bullshit, if I can say that, is, you know, it is bullshit because it's spiritually bypassing the experience of being human. And it's just another shame. It's another way to shame people, you know, is right. If you're not, I mean, I had a spiritual teacher early in my work. So I'd gone through that grief and then I got sober maybe a year and a half after my daughter died. And then I started really opening up and saying, I need to start finding a teacher to help me with this crazy psychic intuitive stuff that's coming to me. The feeling of being a raw nerve in a group, you know, that and everyone in the world's like vinegar, you know, I just felt like that all the time. So I kind of looked at spiritual teachers, and I took a class where someone said, if you have a negative thought and you give into it for 7 seconds, you've now changed your reality. And now, you know, you've kind of sabotaged yourself if you have a negative thought, if it's more than 7 seconds. And I was like, what? That is so horrible to say to people. You know, it basically means you can't be human. You can't have negative thoughts. I mean, anger is a totally healthy, normal emotion. It signals injustice. We need anger. Where anger kills us is when we keep feeding it the story. We don't feel it all the way to its fruition, and then it comes out sideways at some other time, you know. But it's the purposeful ignoring of anger that causes the problem, not the anger itself, you know. So I just couldn't believe some of the stuff I was hearing out there as a bereaved mom. Somebody telling me, oh, if you give in to grief, you're going to have a blockage in your heart chakra. I was like, oh my gosh, that is freaking ridiculous. So, I mean, part of what I've always tried to do is kind of be grounded in the fact that suffering is part of the human experience. And if you don't feel all the range of emotions, you're bypassing being human. You know, you're basically saying to people, you need to be the Buddha, you know, or you're failing. That's ridiculous. You know, that's
well, and I love that you had like the strength of your own sort of internal sense of the world that you were like, no, this is bullshit. Because it's like, for me, it's like I found like in my life and in my journey that I'm such like a goody two shoes, like sort of like A+, you know, trying to be the A+ student always, who I'm like, oh, okay, then yeah, I believe you if you're telling me that like all I have to do is like think this away. You know, there was like this part of me that wanted to, quote unquote, like learn to be like more spiritual or learn to, it's like I didn't realize it's in some of these moments that I was like, like he's spiritually, trying to be spiritually bypassing my own pain, So I love that you were like, no. This needs to happen, and there's nothing wrong with this. Like I think that's so important to hear that you, you had that tether to your own experience where you knew that there was something deeper that needed to be accessed.
Yeah, and it's not easy though. I have a lot of perfectionistic tendencies, which are toxic and not good, right? So I'm not kind of selling it as a positive to be perfectionistic. I mean, I would say my first addiction is work. I'm like a workaholic. So if somebody tells me, hey, if you just work harder, get faster, be thinner, be smart, prettier, I'm doing all those things. If you tell me I need to be more, I believe you. So I have to, I've had to unwind those old patterning, that old patterning of workaholism and perfectionism to say, I have to be okay with where I am right now and know that, I'm on a journey. And it's really about holding space for yourself, right? Taking yourself where you're at. I always tried to pretend I was better, more advanced on the spectrum, like if I was a newbie in a class, I, would read everything I could before the class to try to be as smart, if not smarter than the teacher. And that just, it fails. It lacks willingness. It lacks humility. So I had to kind of unwind that. And really, I also was like, I love magical thinking. I mean, that was some of the stuff I really indulged in when I was in my 20s. It's just like, I'm just going to imagine that, my train is going to come right now, and the train would come and I'd be like, I am magic, man. I am, a manifester. But what happened was, I hate to bring it back to that, but when my child died, it was, I engaged in a lot of that magical thinking that failed. And I had to realize, like, I am not failing here because I'm sad. And that was a huge thing to acknowledge. And even motherhood itself, like with my first child, I remember reading all those kind of books. There's all these hippie books with, giving birth where like you can have an orgasm while you're giving birth and you can transcend pain if you just meditate right. And there's all this hypnobirthing and stuff. So I did natural childbirth. I had read all of that stuff. And I was in it's so painful to give birth that at like 3 or 4 months after my daughter was born, I had kind of like a low level depression. And I said to someone in a really raw moment, I feel like I failed because I felt pain during labor. That's so toxic. I mean, that's toxic perfectionism if there was any. But we kind of sell that in this society that, if you just work a little harder, a little longer, a little, work harder than anyone else, you can do whatever you want. And, we can't do that with emotions. Emotions aren't logicked out. You have to actually feel them and feel the hell out of them and then move to the next feeling, which is usually better. It usually needs acknowledgement and validation. So, for me, that whole law of attraction and magical thinking stuff it's awesome to align your thoughts with what you want, but also you have to just be a human being as well. And I don't think we give people enough permission to be a human being. That's my opinion. So I feel like that's my job, is people come in and like something isn't right. And I do energy work and I work on that energetic field, but I'm also, I think it's really important to be able to say something isn't right and I don't know what it is, and have somebody hold space for that and just say, well, let's talk it out. Let's talk it out, and I'll do a little drumming over you and you'll relax. And when you're in a relaxed state, maybe you'll have more insights. Maybe I'll have some insights and we'll share them. And I feel like that's the crux of my work. Yeah. I don't think I've ever said it
well,
that way. It's good. Yeah.
No, I love it. Yeah, because I'd love to hear more about, like where you are with your practice, like as a practitioner right now. I mean, in terms of holding space for people, like you said, who may be coming in with negative emotions that you're, quote unquote negative emotions that they don't know what to do with. Because like as a reader, as a healer, like where are you finding yourself working these days?
Well, I'm seeing clients one-on-one. I live in Hershey, Pennsylvania, but I see clients in Harrisburg through Alta View Wellness Center. And the one-on-one clients are, coming in basically for, sometimes they'll say they want Reiki or crystal healing or shamanic session, but I kind of combine it all together. So it's really changed my practice because I used to kind of separate all that out. And I also still do tarot readings. And I call my tarot readings now spiritual counseling sessions because they're conversations. So that's where I found my gift is to ask the right questions. And, tarot is such an interesting vehicle into that because it pulls things from the subconscious. If the mother card comes up when we're talking about work, I can say, oh, so who at work reminds you of your mother? And then we realize, okay, there's a mother wound here. And this person who's pissing you off at work is not actually a terrible person. They're just acting in ways that your mother wounded you, right? So that can be a really powerful gift. And so I found that part of my gift as a space holder is to ask questions and to get to the heart of things by using an intuitive method. So, in tarot readings, that's what I'm doing. But when I'm seeing people and they're on my massage table, I'm basically doing shamanic work, which is, it's kind of one of those terms that I'm not sure I should still be using, but I still do because it's an easy way to say old ways of healing, ways of looking at the body holistically. So a lot of it is around trauma and where we store trauma in the body. Like trauma is a somatic experience. And so a lot of the work I'm doing is helping someone process and work on the energy body, work on their trauma through the energy body. And I don't always say that to people. I don't think people really actually want to know all the details of what I'm doing. It's just that I'm tending to their body, listening to their body, validating their body, validating the experiences they went are still stored in the body. And, I see that through imbalances. So a lot of it's intuitive, and that really has come through. I think the connection is with being an artist. As an artist, you're always using your intuitive subconscious to pull images out, to bring things together. And the same thing with a healer. You're kind of working in an intuitive way on what's going to heal the energy body. So I kind of think of it that way, that they're all using the same muscles, the art and the healing. So when somebody's on my table, what I do is I've had a format from my training that I begin with. And then I really am in this super clear state. So one of the things I do is do a lot of meditation, prayer, clean eating, all that kind of stuff on my body so that when I go into session, I can just be a channel or, a clear vehicle of doing my work. So it often feels like I go into another realm, like a deep meditation, and I'm interacting with that person's energy. It sounds so woo-woo when I explain it, but it doesn't feel that way when I'm doing it. It feels like their body, the energy on their body is telling me what needs healing. And sometimes I'll see things from their past that get stuck in their energy. And so I write everything down and share everything I see with them later. And it's often validated. So, but it's an amazing experience. I feel very honored and privileged to do it, that people trust me enough to lay down, close their eyes, and allow me into their energy field to work on them. And so I'm working with people in all kinds of crossroads. They're crossroads with their work or their relationship, or they have a health crisis, or they're just feeling stressed, or they have anxiety. And they might not even know they're at a crossroads, but once they come in and we start talking about things, then they tell me what their intention is, what's been going on in their life, and I work on their body to kind of maximize their energy or their vibration so that they can go and get done what they need to get done. So I like to say, like, I can raise the vibration, but you got to raise your own consciousness, and that's the work, that I hopefully, I see myself a lot as a coach and just validating what they're experiencing and then helping them to strategize for what they need to do in other parts of their life.
So like, how long did that take you to feel like confident doing that, and not feeling like, I mean, not that you ever, again, just from my own perspective, it's like sometimes, when I'm doing a psychic reading or going into a healing, like I still have those like inner thoughts where I'm like, I am a fraud. Like who am I to be doing this? So did you go through any of that, like as you were sort of transitioning into doing this more professionally?
Yeah. I still sometimes do. Like I have that feeling of like, what if nothing comes?
Yeah.
And then I say, well, Angie, then nothing is supposed to come. It's so much of that is just being able to dialogue with the ego and that fear that we have of, from old programming that we need to show up in some way. Like they're paying me to do what I was trained for, right? Which is to work on the energy field. Right. But all I can do is make sure that my vessel's clean, right? That I'm not coming in angry at my husband and thinking of all the things I need to say to him when I leave there, For that hour, I've put that aside. So I'm just coming in as a clear vessel and working on them in the ways I was trained. And so that's all I can do. And so I try not to overpromise, but on the other hand, I often have that feeling of like, what if nothing comes? And then I have to dialogue and say, okay, ego, I know you're here because in the past when we've been embarrassed and we promised something that didn't happen, we felt shame and we felt embarrassment, but we don't do shame anymore here. So if nothing comes, the worst that's going to happen is you give them their money back. But literally no one has ever said, I'm unhappy with this session. Never. Because it doesn't happen. That's not what I'm doing. I'm not in there pretending to cure people. I'm in there in a healing capacity. And when you show up with nurturing, compassion, and love, how can you fail? You're just showing up and holding space and taking people where they're at. And, if I have a bad day, people understand. But I don't think I've ever had a bad day healing. I just go in there and do what I'm supposed to do. And, the other part of my work is, when I'm doing tarot readings, I'm having a conversation and having conversations with people. I'm sure you feel this way in psychic readings too, where it's like, you think nothing's going to come before you're actually in the space. But once you're in the space, it flows. It's like a valve is open and you don't really know where it's coming from. It's just coming, whether it's from the subconscious or from spirit or however you identify that. There's a deep native wisdom within each of us. And we only have to let go to access it. We don't have to do anything special. Does that make sense? I think it's a little confusing for people. They're like, well, what do you do to get that info? And for me, it's like, well, I actually have to not do a lot of things. I have to not second guess myself. I have to not talk myself out of being worthy of getting information. I have to not let old programming come in. So that's kind of how I feel about the psychic work. It's just, not second guessing yourself.
Because I'm like, I know that you're Capricorn, right?
Yeah.
An Earth sign. Yeah. Well, so like I'm Aquarius. My sun is in Aquarius, and my Gemini rising. So I'm all air. I'm all just like in my brain, in my thoughts. And so yeah, the challenge for me as a reader and as a healer is not in not over determining before the session starts, but not like thinking like, okay, well, I know how this is going to go because I've thought about it, and getting to that space where it's like, I don't know what's going to happen. And that's accurate. Like that's the accurate space to be in as you're launching into a genuine, reciprocal healing, container with a person is that like, I can't predict what that's going to be. You have to be in that present moment. And yeah, that's a ding for my ego, who wants to like control things and like know what it is before I do it, cause that's a big thing for me, is like in being the good girl. It's like, well, I know what's going to happen. And so I can steer it in a certain way. And it's like, that's not what healing is about at all.
It's so true, though. I mean, I do psychic development circles too. That's one of the things I've been doing the last, I guess it's been 6 years I've been holding space. And so what happened was people were like, well, I want to do what you do. And I was like, well, what do I do? I don't know what you're talking about. They're like, well, I want to do, psychic work, but I don't know where to start. And I don't want to learn, like, how do you be psychic? How can you be psychic? Can you teach me? And I was like, well, I don't even know how to charge for this. How do you charge for teaching? So I thought, well, maybe if I get a group of people together and I just do all the things that I learned, right? So the first month we talk about what it is to be psychic and we play some psychic games. The second month we do protection and grounding. The third month we do shamanic journey and animal medicine. The fourth month we do angel channeling and ascended master channeling. The fifth month we do the pagan wheel of the year and talking about following an agrarian calendar in your work, like not trying to harvest things in the winter, for example. And then the next month we do psychic tools. The next month we do altar making. And then the last month we do past life regression. And they all sound like they're kind of disparate, right? Like they're all a way, but it's just different aspects and you find your way. Some people really love the animal stuff. Some people really love the angel stuff. But what I realized was that it really wasn't about the content. The real meat of these circles is in the first half hour where we check in. And people, I create these circles where you can't join if you don't join in the beginning. I don't let people join halfway through. And we create this vulnerability and this intimate space. And I kind of say really strong ethics in the beginning. Okay, no one's allowed to hug each other when they're crying. No one's allowed to go get a tissue when someone's crying. No one's allowed to crosstalk. No one's allowed to read people without permission. No one's allowed to say anything like, oh, that happened to me too. And so I have all these rules. It takes, 10, 15 minutes when we start. The first circle, I go through all these ethics and I hold them to it. So if somebody jumps in while somebody's crying to give a tissue, I say, she can get her own tissue. So I tell people, if you need tissue, ask for it. And it sounds really weird, and people think I'm a freaking monster because the first time somebody cries, they're like, how can you just sit there and do nothing? It's like, because they needed to release. And I realized like when we start doing this psychic work, all of our programming starts coming up. So it's not that I'm like a gifted psychic. What I've done is done healing around my childhood wounds that kept me from trusting my own intuition. And so what we're doing in circle is I'm not making anybody psychic. I'm trying to take away the stuff that stands in the way of you trusting yourself. And once we start holding a sacred space, like these women that come in, they're there once a month, they hold space for other people, and then they don't really hang out with those people until the next month. So this is a private space where they can talk about, I had this weird dream, and in this dream, this happened, or my father died and my brother won't talk to me, or this is happening in my life. And we all just sit and listen, and they cry and they, act out. And I can say that in the first 2 or 3 circles, nobody shares really deep stuff. They share about, a deer crossed my road on the way here. I don't know what that means. So I looked it up, and then I saw a deer on a t-shirt that I really liked and I bought it. They'll share those kind of things. But as the circle goes on, it gets deeper and deeper and more intimate and more vulnerable. And it ends up being a space where they actually can acknowledge and honor their spirit, who they are and who they really are, the authentic self. And that leads you to being more intuitive and trusting yourself. So it's about getting out of the linear thought. We're going to kind of like dump all of our stuff in the beginning, and then we can do this work and play with it and have fun and laugh. And And then I end with a meditation. And it's been such a game changer for me to see, I'm learning too. Like I thought, oh, I'm just going to be training them to do all this stuff. And I realized like the meat of it is holding space for each other and learning how to hold space for another person, and that's what we do in psychic readings. Like, I love what you said when you're like, hey, I'm sitting here thinking I have to know what's going to happen. And that's the whole point, not to know what happens, but being able to sit with that, that's a hard thing to reconcile. And it's why other people in our lives that criticize what we do don't understand it, because they can't imagine going into a space without having an agenda, without having control, without having all your wounds neatly tucked away and not right on the surface. Because how many times do we go into a psychic reading and we see or feel something and we're like, man, that's my wound. They're hitting my wound. And we can feel the tears coming and we're like, I'm not supposed to cry here. And yet I can't help it because I'm a human being and I've been wounded, and we allow it to happen. So I don't know. I went off topic, but I mean, it's a powerful gift to be able to hold space for others. And as my circle went on, I did the first level. People said, well, I want to learn how to hold space. So my second level is all about them becoming the person holding space for other people, not just for themselves. But first we have to learn how to hold space for ourselves and do our own freaking work. So hopefully that's part of the legacy I want to bring into what I do as a teacher, is to help people learn how to accept their own wounds and hold space for themselves. And that can translate to holding space for others.
Well, and I was just going to say, like, I love everything that you were just saying, because I think the two things that sound like they really make that possible is time and the boundaries that you set. Like, you as the boundary holder, I think I think a lot of times what we, just as sort of like in our everyday waking life, like I was saying, in trying to predict, what's going to happen in a conversation or what's going to happen in some setting, is like, that's me trying to ground in the wrong way, like that. And so I think the fact that you are able to go into these spaces and you create this container that has these very apparent rules, I think that creating that sense of safety, I mean, that's what it's all about. So I mean, I can imagine that there's like you said, great strides in people's growth and in people's ability to go deep, because when someone has set the rules of the container the way that you're able to do, that's amazing. Like, what a gift just to give people a space that feels that safe. I mean, like, how often do we go into any situation anywhere that feels that safe, so that's amazing. And then also number two, I think that time, just duration, just giving people that connected knowing that they're going to see each other next month. Again, I think that really does foster that sense of you're safe to go deep, because it's not just going to evaporate tomorrow or next week or whatever. Like, weekend workshops and stuff like that can be great and can be really helpful, but there's really no replacement for going deep from a time perspective.
Oh, absolutely. And when we start opening up and we start exploring these things, we're like, oh, I really like crystals. I think I'm going to go buy all the crystals, or I really like tarot. I think I'm going to read all the books on tarot. That's great. I mean, we tend to be devourers of information in this, day and age where all we do is Google and we get, a million things back. But the truth is, like, taking time and integrating and working with it is a really powerful part. Just, hey, it's enough that you just learned how to shamanic journey. You don't have to journey every single day and burn out and never do that again. You can just do one journey a month and see how that works for you. And then now this is a tool in your toolkit. And when you need more information, you can journey and go in for a reason, ask a question, get an answer, come back out. And, whether you're imagining you're journeying into another dimension or you're traveling into the self, there's still powerful gifts that you can get in that space. And, learning how to almost dial back that, I want to consume everything right now idea can be really a gift, for our, when we're learning how to open to our intuitive selves. What was interesting, and I don't know if you'll find this interesting, but a few years ago, guys started coming to me and they said, well, do you do this circle for men? And the way I was trained was, men with men, women with women. And I was like, no, I only really work with women. And then another guy asked me the same week. And then a week later, another guy asked me. I was like, geez, I finally called my shamanic teacher. I was like, what do you think about this? I feel weird. Maybe I'm not supposed to be the one. She said, they're asking you. Clearly spirit's thinking that you have something to learn here. I was like, all right. So I'm going to teach them the same thing as I teach the women, and I'm going to do it the same way. It's just men. So I decided to open the circle. I put it online and I said, okay, I'm doing this circle. I had 12 men respond to me within a week. I had to close it because that's pretty much what all I do is 12 people, just for intimacy's sake. And the first class starts and, people are coming down into the classroom and I was like, oh my gosh, do I hug them? I suddenly started second guessing everything about who I was as a space holder and realizing like, this is going to be about you learning about men. And every single one of them basically started the circle by saying, I've never been able to talk to men about my spiritual journey, and realizing like, man, what have we done to men here in this society? Like, feminism gave us really awesome language to talk about our emotions, who we are, to empower us. I mean, are we still, we still have so much work to do in bigger society, but like it gave us a language that we are pretty versed in now. Men do not have any language for this, and they don't know how to be intuitive, and they don't know how to be spiritual in the way that we're taught in women's circles and feminism, because it's feminine. And there's all of these masks and rules to being male. And it was so interesting. These guys were amazing. They were dedicated, but I noticed so much shadow stuff with my masculine self, and my feminine self, where, I was so used to women's circles where I would say something and everybody wanted to jump in. It's like, oh, I know that happened to me too. I understand that. But I would say something to the men. I'd be like, hey, when you're working with animal medicine, you may be having dreams or they may cross your path. And I would stop, because usually that's where people would jump in and tell me all their animal stories. And guys would just be nodding like, yep. Yeah, nothing to share. And I'm simply like, I am failing these men. I really found myself like second guessing my own ability to teach, and I realized it's just men, react differently and they interact differently. And I had to see the ways I was actually very feminine in the way I communicated. Because I always felt like in feminine circles, I was too masculine, and in masculine circles, I was too feminine. But the truth is, we're all a combination of both, and I think I can be a really solar feminine leader. And these men that were coming to me were lunar masculine people. They were very intuitive and psychic, and they were learning how to integrate that into being a man and being masculine in our society. And what a gift they're doing. They're changing our world. And I said, I'm training you guys. Now you guys go out and start men's circles, because I don't think I need to be the only women in a men's circle. You guys need your own spaces without, to where you can talk about this stuff. And I think they felt comfortable with me because I was like an outsider. I was not trying to jump in and say I understood what it was like to be a guy, because I don't. So it was really interesting and took my practice to a whole other level.
Oh, I can imagine. I mean, because, like you said, just all the stuff that probably came up, through that for your own self. And then that's amazing. I'm major props to you for like being willing to confront that in yourself, and then transform this space where these men could transform themselves. Because that's really the vanguard, right? I mean, that's what we're coming up next on, is just men really getting with the healing and clearing all this programming that's been like bogging down, like you were saying, for feminism. I mean, there is that aspect where it's like feminism is not just for women, it's for men too, right? It's to learn how to have these conversations and to respect where their energy is coming from in a more holistic way. So that's beautiful.
Right. We're all victims of toxic masculinity. Men are also victims of toxic masculinity too. So it's not just women that are. And, are we giving men space in spiritual circles to talk about the effect that has had on their psyche?
Right.
It's powerful work. And I mean, I love people like, that are in the community doing some of that work, but it's mostly dominated by women. And so it's interesting. And, men have a different role. I'd like to see more men out there who are actually owning shadow stuff, because sometimes I see the men in the spiritual communities still taking on that guru role, which I think, is so toxic.
Yeah. Well, and that's what we're hungry for. I mean, like I was saying with boundaries and safety and grounding, I think that's a lot of times where people think they're going to get their grounding from a guru, get their grounding from someone else who quote unquote knows better, and being able to have the spiritual maturity to say like, yeah, I may not know better, but I know how to hold space, like you were saying, and training people who have the discernment to know the difference between those things is really cool.
Yeah. And, part of it is showing, like, you mentioned earlier, you said like that it looks like I'm doing all the stuff. And the truth is, it's like, I had to learn how to do that. Like I had to learn how to reparent myself, and I had to learn how to own my shadow, because I was taught to hide it. I was taught that if I own my vulnerabilities, I'm going to get hurt. And so we still can fall into that so easily, to pretend like, every day is, the perfect juicing yoga day is just a myth. It's like, it doesn't happen. But I know the things that work for me, and I can share that, when I need a reset. And a lot of times, like when I think about social media and how curated it is, I think about, how toxic that can be in and of itself, because there's an idea of curating things and making sure they're acceptable for people and all of that, when really the spiritual journey is about the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the fact that some days are not curated. Some days are like Netflix binge and, using all the soul sedatives that I know just to get out of a feeling, and then resetting. And how do you reset? I mean, what I'm interested is not in being mired in the Netflix binge or being mired in the yoga binge. The part that's interesting is, how do you move from the Netflix binge to resetting? Like what happens in that moment where you decide, hey, I think I want to do better right now. This thing isn't working. The Netflix binge is making me more depressed. What do I do now? How do I reset my day? What does that look like? That's, to me, is so much more interesting than the two extremes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, and it's like you were saying about like teaching someone to do a journey, is there can be this way where it's very heady, where it's like, okay, I understand what this technique is and I know what it is, and so therefore I'm going to move beyond it or whatever. But like you were saying, like teaching someone like to go within and have that sort of sense of bioavailability. I mean, I think that's exactly what you're saying is having these tools and having these techniques, and then having the wisdom to access them when you need them,
Yeah, absolutely. And that idea too is that we have all these tools in the toolkit. Now, if we hide the toolkit under the bed and we never pull it out, it's useless. But the faster we get to our toolkit, that's where we measure real spiritual growth. It's not always doing it, because that's not possible. But the idea that, hey, I'm going to reset a little faster this time. I'm not going to let that Netflix binge go for 3 days. I'm only going to do it for 12 hours. That's where we can really measure our spiritual growth, is in these small incremental changes and noticing how much quicker we get back into our spiritual self, instead of the mindless self. I think mindfulness gets really, I don't know, it's one of those buzzwords that everybody throws around. But before I started my spiritual journey, I really was living mindlessly. It was just, if I was hungry, I ate it. If I wanted to drink that thing, I drank it. If I wanted to, go buy that thing, I bought it. I didn't really think about the consequences of that. I didn't really think about why I'm spending so much money on books that I'm not going to read, and using, the buying and consuming of knowledge as a way to get out of feeling actual emotions. So once I become more mindful and start walking the spiritual journey, I might be holding all those books in my hand before I get to the counter going, what are you doing, Ange? What are you doing? I noticed that in my life. I was buying spiritual self-help books like they were drugs, and trying, consuming them like I'm going to get fixed by reading the book, not actually doing what it says in the book, So
Right.
That's that spiritual bypassing too. So for me, it's just about that mindfulness is really just about noticing, who are we? What is that wound? What am I trying to do to solve that wound? And is it going to help or hinder,
Well, and also I think sometimes too that, when mindfulness gets talked about sort of in more mainstream settings and, corporate, like things where it's just about making you a better, more productive, worker, which is so gross. But I think that the misnomer of mindfulness can often be, this disconnected noticing, where it's yes, I'm mindfully noticing, whatever, when the embodiment of the noticing and feeling where you're feeling some discomfort that you're trying to wriggle away from or whatever, that's the game changer.
Yeah.
Realizing oh, I'm having this feeling in my solar plexus, and the inside of me is feeling a certain way, and that's what you're being mindful of. I think that's once you start sort of connecting those two, that's when things really, like you said, you know when to reach for things in your toolbox, and when you can shift yourself into a different reality, really. It's you can shift out of that anxiety or out of that chasing of something that seems like it's going to quote unquote fix you,
Yeah, absolutely.
And that marrying of the two.
Yeah, there's this, I don't know if you know Melinda Skyme, or Mindy Skyme. She does this badass self-care, and she has this great daily reflection book called My Sacred Pause. And one of the things she said recently, she was talking about, she does a lot of body awareness and eating disorder recovery. And she said, hey, I don't think it's a bad thing to emotionally eat. She just kind of said, I just don't think we should label it bad or good. If we know what we're doing and we're emotionally eating, then hey, go for it. Hey, I'm having this cookie because I had a bad day and I want to reset. But it's the idea that we're mindlessly doing it and then ignoring it, then hiding it, then in a shame loop, or we're labeling it bad or good. That's really the problem. If we know what we're doing and we do it, I'm having a drink because I need to relax right now. It's not a bad thing to have a drink to relax. It's a bad thing to drink a bottle to relax and pretend like it's self-care. But, when we're doing one thing and being mindful of it, it's not exactly that good and bad paradigm is just so binary and so toxic that we really have to get out of it, and so just being aware and bringing awareness to it can be so helpful. So yeah, I'd love.
No, that's the name of the game. That's the name of the game, that awareness. Well, and speaking of being aware, where should people be aware of you and your presence online and in the world, and what you're up to going forward?
Well, my website's kind of my hub for everything. It's just angieyingst.com. if you're in central Pennsylvania, I work through Alta View Wellness Center. That's where I teach. And then I work at Hibiscus Moon Crystal Academy as one of the crystal coaches. So I mentor our students who are going through the program, and just help answer questions and things like that. And that's just hibiscusmoon.com. But yeah, I'm also on social media, and I love, connecting with people there too. So I think I want to say my Instagram is probably the best place for me, because I post more on Instagram than anything else. And I think it's under Uber Angie. But it could be Still Life Angie. That might be my Twitter. I'm so bad at social media. I should know all these things off the top of my head. But
I'll link to them in the show notes for people too. I'll look it up. Yeah, I'll confirm it.
Yeah, I used to write a blog called Still Life with Circles, and that was all about my grief journey. And it's part of when I, really started exploring my spirituality was through that writing. So that's why sometimes it says Still Life Angie, because I was, Still Life with Circles. So.
Well, and and before we round out, I just have to say, I love your writing so much. There's so many ways that we connect, and I feel like our journeys are very similar. Very divergent in a lot of ways too, but I've always just really, really connected with you. And especially as a writer, I think that your writing is just, really gorgeous and really, really special, and really something. Your voice is so valuable, because I think that it's a voice that is rare and is beautiful. And so I would encourage everyone who's listening to go check out the copious backlog of blog posts and everything that you have online, because it's really medicinal in the best possible way.
Oh, thank you. Writing is my passion. I literally could sit down and write for 8 hours every single day, but I've got other stuff going on. I just keep thinking, when my kids go to school all day, I'll be writing all day, but I'll probably find something else to do. It's just the curse of writing.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's this refrigerator needs to be cleaned before I
exactly.
I sit down and write this. Yeah.
My pantry is always clean when I'm writing something that has a deadline. So.
Yeah. Well, Angie, thank you so much for being with me on the podcast today. This was an amazing conversation, and I'm so pleased to get to introduce your work to all of my listeners.
Thank you so much for having me. I had so much fun. I could literally talk to you all day, so thanks so much.
We'll be sure to do it again.
Okay,
absolutely.
Sounds good.
So part of the reason I was so thrilled to have Angie on the show as a guest today is because she's one of a very small number of spiritual practitioners that I trust with my own healing work. Although I originally connected with her online through her writing, I've also paid for multiple reading and healing sessions with her over the years, and can personally attest to the high quality of not only her wisdom and spiritual insight, but also her personal ethics. She's the real deal, folks. I'm also excited to make more space for having these kinds of discussions about spirituality here on the podcast. As I mentioned near the beginning of our conversation, I've tended to keep my experiences as a psychic reader and energy healer a little bit on the down low over the years, choosing to foreground my work as a writer and a musician. But as Angie herself said here today, they're all using the same muscles, the art and the healing. So I don't necessarily think of spirituality and healing work as being any different from the topics of conversation that you're used to hearing me talk about here on the podcast, whether that's movies or books or art or theater. So just FYI, keep an eye out for more of these kinds of conversations in the very near future. In the meantime, be sure to check out more of Angie's work online. Her website is angieyingst.com. And through there, you'll be able to find links to her Twitter, which is Still Life Angie, and her Instagram, which is Uber Angie, and so much more. And of course, links to all this information will be available on my website as well, which is queenofpeaches.com. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. If you're a new listener, you can find the previous 9 episodes of the show through your favorite podcast app by searching for the show title, I'll Follow You, or you can find them all archived online at anchor.fm/aphyllis. Bye for now.